12 Angry Men by Reginald Rose. Eighth juror, that's right. It isn't. Play opens on an empty jury room. It is large and shabby with a table in the center with 12 chairs around it. Outside the windows, New York City is visible. Attached to the jury room, a washroom is partially visible. Extra chairs and a bench are strewn about the room, along with pads, pencils, and ashtrays. Though there are no people in the room, the judge's voice can be heard, giving the 12 members of the jury instructions on how to deliberate about the first-degree murder case they just heard. A 16-year-old boy stands accused of stabbing his father to death. The judge reminds the jury that they must deliver a not guilty verdict if they have reasonable doubt. In the event of a guilty verdict, the boy will face the death penalty. The 12 men of the jury, known only by their juror numbers, enter the room. They begin to talk about the heat and the fact that this is the hottest day of the year. The seventh juror is very impatient because he has tickets to a ball game that evening and wants to get the vote over with. Many of the jurors treat the case as though it's open and shut and that it's obvious the boy is guilty. The 10th juror makes a racist comment, assuming the boy is guilty because of his race. The jurors take a preliminary vote. 11 vote guilty, and the 8th juror votes not guilty. Many of the jurors are angry about this. The 8th juror says that he's unsure what he thinks, and because a man's life is at stake, he thinks they should take the time to discuss the case. The 7th juror is especially impatient, and the 8th juror asks him to talk for an hour, reminding him he can still make the game. The 8th juror argues for compassion since the boy has had a hard life, while the 10th juror makes more racist comments, saying that people of the defendant's race are born liars. The 9th juror, who is an older man, tells the 10th juror that he's ignorant. They go around the table in order and try and convince the 8th juror that the boy is guilty. The 2nd juror says he feels it was obvious from the start that the boy was guilty. The 3rd juror is convinced by the testimony of the boy's downstairs neighbor, an old man who said that he heard the boy shout, "I'm gonna kill you." The old man said he then heard a body fall and saw the boy run down the stairs seconds later. The 4th juror feels that the boy's alibi, being at the movies, is flimsy because he couldn't remember what movie he saw. The 10th juror interrupts to bring up the 2nd witness, a woman who lived across the street from the boy. She testified that she saw the boy murder his father through the windows of a passing elevated train. The 8th juror asks the 10th juror why he believes the woman but not the boy, given that they are the same race. The 5th juror, a night nurse, chooses not to speak as they go around the table. The 6th juror points out that the boy has a motive, because the neighbors testified the boy's father hit him earlier in the evening. The 8th juror argues that it isn't a very strong motive because the boy had been hit his entire life, so it's questionable that it would suddenly make him homicidal. The 7th juror is convinced the defendant is guilty because the boy has a history of violence and minor crimes. The 3rd juror interrupts to talk about how angry kids in general are. He tells a story about how, when his son was 9, he saw him walk away from a fight and it made him sick. He vowed to make a man out of his son. His son hit him back when he was 16, and they haven't spoken in 2 years. He is embarrassed about his disclosure. The 4th and 10th jurors say that kids in slums are menaces. The 5th juror, who grew up in and still nurses in a slum, takes offense. The jurors get into a fight about how to discuss the case. The 8th juror begins to question how competent the boy's lawyer was and said there was a lot of circumstantial evidence in the trial. The jurors begin to discuss the knife found in the father's body, and the 8th juror requests to see the weapon. The 4th juror recites the facts. The boy admitted to going out of the house at 8 p.m., after his father hit him. The boy went to a junk shop and bought a switchblade with a carved handle, which the storekeeper said was one of a kind. The boy showed his friends the switchblade. He went home until 11:30 p.m., when he claimed to go to the movies, returning home at 3:14 a.m., where he was arrested for his father's murder. The boy said that his knife fell through a hole in his pocket, which the fourth juror calls a fabrication. The eighth juror says it's possible it did happen and that someone else killed the father with a similar knife. The third juror yells that it's not possible. The eighth juror produces an identical knife, which he said he found at a pawn shop in the boy's neighborhood. The eighth juror says that if they take a secret vote and no one agrees with him, he won't stop them from submitting a guilty verdict. One person votes not guilty. The jury room erupts in conversation. The third juror accuses the fifth juror of flipping his vote until the ninth juror says that he flipped his vote to not guilty because he wants to talk more about the case. They take a break. The eighth juror goes to the bathroom, and the seventh and sixth jurors both try to convince him to give up. When they resume the deliberation, the sixth juror asks who else would have a motive to kill the father. The eighth juror says plenty of people, as he wasn't a great guy. The third juror points out that people heard the boy say to his father that he was going to kill him. The eighth juror says he doesn't think that the old man could have accurately determined who yelled that. They then begin a discussion about the impact of the elevated train on the witness's ability to determine the murderer. Exasperated, the third juror tries to start a game of tic-tac-toe, which the eighth juror throws away, saying that the proceedings aren't a game. They almost come to blows. The eighth juror resumes talking about the train, asking the jurors to estimate how long it would take for the train to pass by the apartment building. They estimate 10 seconds. The eighth juror says that means the train was roaring by during the murder, which would make it impossible for the old man to hear who yelled, "I'm going to kill you." The eighth juror also says that "I'm going to kill you" is an everyday phrase. The third juror says no one could be as accurate as the eighth juror is requiring, and the eighth juror says that accuracy is crucial when a boy's life is at stake. The sixth juror defends the ninth juror after the third juror is dismissive of the ninth juror, and they almost come to blows. The ninth juror takes the floor, explaining that he observed the old man carefully, and given that he has been a nobody much of his life, the old man might have convinced himself he's witnessed the murderer just so someone would listen to him. The 10th juror asks the 9th juror what he knows about it, and the 9th juror is embarrassed. The 5th juror changes his vote to not guilty. The 11th juror makes the point that, if the boy had killed his father, why would he return to the scene of the crime? Others argue that he wanted to retrieve his knife, but the 11th juror suggests that would be foolish. The 8th juror calls for another vote, which comes out 8-4, favoring guilty, after the 11th juror changed his vote to not guilty. Angry, the 3rd juror picks up a knife from the table, saying that the boy stabbed his father with it. The 9th juror points out that that isn't the murder weapon, but the knife the 8th juror bought. They then discuss the fact that the old man said he ran to the door of his apartment before seeing the boy go down the stairs after the murder. However, the old man limped in the court and had trouble walking. The 8th juror recreates the distance from the bed to the hallway to the door that leads to the stairs, using the court exhibit of the boy's apartment to estimate the distance. Though the old man testified it took him 15 seconds, the 8th juror's test shows he couldn't have done it in under 42 seconds. This impresses the 6th juror. The 3rd juror gets angry, makes misogynist remarks, and says the boy has to burn. The 8th juror accuses the 3rd juror of wanting to see the boy die for personal reasons. The 3rd juror gets so upset, he says of the 8th juror, "I'll kill him." The curtain falls. The jurors are recovering from the altercation at the end of Act 1. The guard, hearing the yelling, comes in to check on them. The 11th juror points out that they have a responsibility and that it's their duty to democracy to come to a verdict rather than getting caught up in internal fighting. The jurors talk about the fact that a storm is coming. The room has gotten darker. The jurors decide to have an open vote. The vote comes out tied 6-6, with the 2nd and 6th jurors changing their votes. The men fight. It begins to rain. The foreman begins to talk about a football game he coached that happened in the rain, with a special player he was impressed by. The 3rd, 4th, and 10th jurors talk in the washroom. They think the other 6 are not going to change their minds. The 10th juror wants to quit so that the jury will be hung. The 3rd juror is offended by the suggestion, saying that it's a dishonest thing to do. The 10th juror says he doesn't care what happens. He leaves the side conversation in the washroom and suggests declaring a hung jury. The 7th juror agrees. The 11th juror says that maybe he doesn't know what the term reasonable doubt means. The 7th juror gets angry because the 11th juror is an immigrant, and he says disparaging things about his ethnicity. The 8th juror points out that it would be hard for the defendant to remember details after an emotionally intense experience. He says that it makes sense that the boy couldn't remember the specifics of the movie even though it was his alibi. The 4th juror disagrees. The 8th juror asks the 4th to remember the details from a movie he saw a few days ago. The 4th juror cannot remember everything and gets details wrong. The foreman points out that a psychiatrist testified that the boy was capable of murder. The 10th juror says that psychiatry isn't a valid profession. The 11th juror points out that a few of the jurors might also have the subconscious desire to kill, but that doesn't make them guilty of murder. The 10th juror argues, saying that the psychiatrist testified the boy was capable of murder. The 8th juror points out the 10th juror's inconsistencies, that he professes both not to believe into psychiatry and to use the psychiatrist's testimony to prove the boy's guilt. This angers the 10th juror. The 2nd juror points out that the downward angle of the stabbings doesn't make sense, given that the boy was 7 inches shorter than his father. He uses the knife to demonstrate that it's awkward to stab that way. The 3rd juror demonstrates on the 8th juror how the angles could have made sense, but the 5th juror argues that you hold a switchblade underhanded. The 8th juror asks the 12th juror what he thinks, and the 12th juror says he doesn't know. The 7th juror changes his vote to not guilty because he's had enough. This angers the 11th juror, saying he's playing with a man's life and that he doesn't have the guts to do what's right. The 7th juror admits he's convinced that the boy isn't guilty. They vote again with a show of hands. The foreman and the 12th juror flip, making the vote 9-3 in favor of a not guilty verdict. Only the 3rd, 4th, and 10th jurors vote guilty. The 10th juror makes a racist speech, arguing that these people are born to lie and don't need an excuse to kill someone. He says human life doesn't mean as much to them as it does to us. He says that the immigrants are dangerous and will breed us out of existence. He doesn't care about the law, but that they can make a difference by killing one of the boy's kind. The 4th juror tells him to sit down and not open his filthy mouth again. The 4th juror describes why he thinks the boy is guilty, relying on the testimony of the woman across the street. She stated that she saw the boy kill his father through the windows of the passing train. The 3rd and 4th jurors say that they can toss out all the other evidence except the woman's testimony. They call for another vote, and the 12th juror switches back to a guilty verdict. The 3rd juror calls for a hung jury. The 4th juror takes off his glasses and rubs the indentations on either side of his nose. The ninth juror says that it reminds him of the woman as she testified. He noticed the same indentations on the woman's face and that she rubbed her nose when she was testifying. The eighth juror points out that she wouldn't have had her glasses on the night of the murder because she was lying in bed. He asks if she could have made a mistake. The third juror says it isn't possible. The 12th juror says it's possible and changes his vote back to not guilty. The 10th juror changes his vote as not guilty, seeing he's outnumbered. The 4th juror says that he also has a reasonable doubt. It's now 11-1 in favor of a not guilty verdict. The 3rd juror is the last holdout. He's furious. The 8th juror asks the 3rd juror for his arguments. He calls them all bleeding hearts. The others remain silent. He says that everything that happened in court proves the boy is guilty. He says everything has been twisted in the jury room and that the boy said he was going to kill his father. He says he is a rotten kid and that kids can kill you every day. He says he can feel the knife going in. The 8th juror tells him the boy is not his son. The 4th juror says to let him live. The 3rd juror changes his vote to not guilty. The jurors leave to go to the jury box. The 8th juror brings the 3rd juror his jacket and helps him put it on. They are the last to go,